Good evening. I'm Crystal Harding, a student at Kansas State and a Lou Douglas Lecture student intern. On behalf of the lecture series, I would like to welcome you to the second lecture of the 1990 Lou Douglas Lectures on Public Affairs. The Lou Douglas Lectures were begun 10 years ago to honor the memory of Lou Douglas, a distinguished Kansas State professor and supporter of UFM from its beginning. Continuing sponsors of the series include the University for Man, Office of the Provost, Student Governing Association, Division of Continuing Education, and Pre-Law Club. Tonight, we are especially appreciative of the support from the Department of Human Ecology and Family Studies, the College of Human Ecology, and the Ecumenical Christian Ministries. The next Lou Douglas lecture will be Thursday, October 11th at 7:30 p.m. in McCain Auditorium. Please note the change of day and place. The speaker will be Amory Levins, who will speak on negawatts. Following tonight's lecture, please join us in the Forum Hall lobby for punch and a chance to speak personally with tonight's speaker. Tonight's lectures and all lectures are videoed live by Living Images Video Enterprises and are available in Farrell Library. Please note that tonight's programs are printed on recycled paper, and due to the expense, we would appreciate their return. A table in the lobby will be provided for this purpose. Now, to introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to introduce Professor Gary Coates from the Department of Architecture.
Good evening. I have the pleasure this evening of introducing to you David Orr, who is a friend and a colleague with whom I've been associated since the early 1980s. David Orr was born in Des Moines, Iowa, was raised in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. He holds a bachelor's from Westminster College, a master's from Michigan State, both of which are in history, and a doctorate in international relations from the University of Pennsylvania. David Orr has taught at Agnes Scott College and at the University of North Carolina. And after a decade of teaching in the halls of the Academy, decided that, I guess you might say, there needed to be something more to complement the capacities and the possibilities of the university. And in 1979, he co-founded the Meadow Creek Project, which is a nonprofit environmental education organization located in north central Arkansas, a little town called Fox. Meadow Creek was conceived as a laboratory for exploring the question of how to create a sustainable society. And Meadow Creek was a laboratory to examine questions about how to what sustainability means for economics, for architecture, and the other great issues confronting us in the late 20th century. He saw it as a place where students and faculty from many universities around the country could come and could participate in actual experiments to test and develop new ideas and new possibilities, a place where head learning and hand learning might be joined. At Kansas State, I had the good fortune of working with David and the other people at the Meadow Creek Project, where we were involved from the College of Architecture and Design in developing master plan proposals with David. And we had two buildings that were designed by Kansas State students as thesis projects, passive solar heated and cooled buildings that the Meadow Creek Project hired these students when they graduated to build their thesis projects, providing the kind of, you might say, learning opportunities that the university is not truly able to provide. After 11 years at Meadow Creek, where he developed that organization into a very substantial place for some very innovative educational programs, he began this fall as director of environmental studies program at Oberlin College, where again he hopes to bring many of his very imaginative ideas into the halls of academe, learning from his experiences at Meadow Creek. Dr. Orr's publications include The Global Predicament, co-edited with Marvin Sarus, University of North Carolina Press, and a book he's working on now tentatively titled What is Education For? Education and the Transition to a Postmodern World. He has published articles in a wide range of journals from Alternatives, Annals of Earth, Bioscience, Citizen Participation, Conservation Biology, Dissent, The Ecologist, the Harvard Educational Review, just to list the different publications he has published in would take us much further. Among his other activities, Dr. Orr is the education editor for Conservation Biology. He's a member of the Pew Scholars Advisory Board, a member of the advisory board of the George Gallup International Institute, a member of the Board of Trustees of the Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation, a member of the Lindisfarne Fellows, a member of the National Environmental Leadership Council. He's on the advisory board of the Cummings Foundation. And I might say, as a personal note and a note of thanks to Dr. Orr, during the decade of the 1980s, the programs that occurred at the Meadow Creek Project in Fox, Arkansas, were some of the most exciting, intellectually exciting occasions that I've had the good fortune to participate in. And I think the Meadow Creek Project kept alive the spirit of the environmental movement and was a kind of think tank for the leaders in the environmental movement, activists, theorists, people from all disciplines who were able to come together under the impresario leadership of Dr. Orr. And I think that will bear fruit for us in the what promises to be the activist decade of the 90s and beyond. So I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. David Orr.
The buildings that were designed and constructed by Kansas State University students were, when I left Meadow Creek to go to Ohio, were still standing. So there's hope for all of you here at Kansas State. I want to say a word of thanks to Gary. Gary and the students from Kansas State were an important part of Meadow Creek and were an important part of the vitality of the organization. The idea that architecture and pedagogy were linked was a difficult connection to make, and Gary helped to make that easy and exciting, and I think a permanent part of North Arkansas. I want to say a word of thanks to the Lou Douglas Committee. This has been nice to be back here in Kansas. I over the past 10 years, have gotten here periodically. You know, Kansas is a nice state. People back in Ohio think of Kansas as flat, and it's not exactly flat. As a matter of fact, Lorain County, Ohio, where I'm now located, is flat. I mean, it's as flat as the floor on which I'm standing. If you drop a bowling ball anywhere in Lorain County, it's going to stay there until the next ice sheet pushes it off. Kansas is a nice place. Thanks to the committee for your hospitality and for the cordial reception. Okay, it's been a nice day. The title of my remarks, Refugees or Homecomers, the Coming Ruralization of America, has some resonance with some of you. It wasn't long ago that a man from New Jersey was talking about turning Kansas into a Buffalo Commons. Then I come along within a year or so of his remarks and say that it may be that we're going to turn parts of Kansas into a commons for people from New Jersey. The subtitle of my remarks, The Coming Ruralization of America, is clearly an affront to both sociological trends that are several centuries old and to recent census data. The most recent census report shows a decline in rural population in the United States down to 22.9%. In 1970, it was 31.4%. In 1950, it was 43.9%. There has been a steady attrition of people living in rural America. There's a widespread belief that, in fact, our trend is to be predominantly an urban society, that the trend would level out with maybe 85 or 90% of Americans living in urban and in suburban areas. And the folks who are still out in rural America will be primarily caretakers in large agribusiness firms or simply diehards who don't know when to give up a bad thing. Tonight, I want to ask you to put your eyes toward the historical horizon. And I think what we will see, or what you will see when you examine that horizon, are not level plains so much as a broken topography. We face, I think, major historical discontinuities. My thesis is very simple. It is simply that in the longer perspective of our time, megalopolis, which we now take for granted as something normal in human affairs, will be seen as an aberration. Our fate as a species is to live in smaller cities, in towns, and in villages, and in rural areas. One of my favorite Far Side cartoons shows a woman sitting on the right-hand side of a car, and you know the mirror on the right-hand side of the car says down at the bottom, objects in mirror are closer than they appear. And so in the Far Side cartoon, there is this huge bloodshot eyeball in the mirror. I think in a way, megalopolis, if megalopolis looks in that mirror, it will see a large bloodshot eyeball. I don't want to argue that ruralization will be a process of catastrophe or trauma, although it well could be. What I would like to argue is that the big numbers of our time are running against megalopolis, perhaps against urban areas generally. Let me give three reasons. The first reason, and related to our being in Saudi Arabia, the first reason is simply that we've arrived at the end of the fossil fuel era. We have been living as a part of, in cities, as a part of a bonanza. And it's a one-time bonanza. Fossil fuels, the cheap, easily extractable fossil fuels, are now mostly gone. And it was cheap fossil fuels that helped to create the city. If you could concentrate energy and burn it at a time or place of your choosing, you could concentrate people. If one farmer could feed 75 people, the other 74, or whatever the number would be minus his family, could then move to urban areas. And this, in fact, began to happen. But oil production, as M. King Hubert, working for the U.S. Geological Survey, predicted in 1956, oil production in the United States peaked, in fact, in 1970. It has declined ever since. The Alaskan North Slope oil didn't affect the decline. Last year was the largest single decline of any one year. Hubert, some years later, wrote these words, and I think they're prophetic. It now appears that the period of rapid population and industrial growth that has prevailed during the last few centuries, instead of being the normal order of things and capable of continuance into the indefinite future, is actually one of the most abnormal phases of human history. It represents only a brief transitional episode between two very much longer periods, each characterized by rates of change so slow as to be regarded as essentially a period of non-growth. It is paradoxical, he continued, that although the forthcoming period of non-growth poses no insuperable physical or biological problems, it will entail a fundamental revision of those aspects of our current economic and social thinking which stem from the assumption that growth rates which have characterized this temporary period can be permanent. Now, even if fossil fuels don't run out, and in some sense they won't run out, they simply become too expensive to produce, or the energy that we get from burning them exceeds or is less than the energy it took to extract them. We've arrived at the end of the era of cheap energy. Let me give a second reason. This has to do with global warming. Even if fossil energy were abundant for another several centuries, we know now that we are committed, or most scientists now agree that we're committed to a massive increase in the temperature of the planet. By most estimates, the Earth is now 0.7 degrees centigrade warmer than it was at the turn of the century. If we were to stop emitting heat-trapping gases today, we would still be 2.5 degrees centigrade warmer because of a residual heating effect that's now already in the pipeline. Now, what will this mean? Well, quite frankly, we don't know. The more scientists have learned, the more we discover that there are aberrant things beginning to happen that weren't thought to be likely to occur until much further into this process. So we see biological systems unraveling. It depends a great deal on whether you talk to biologists or whether you talk to climate physicists. In talking to biologists, we see a whole series of things beginning to happen related to global warming. What else will happen? Well, I think it's likely that from most of the studies, the heat and drought, changes in rainfall patterns will shift grain growing areas northward into the Great Plains of Canada. Southern agricultural production will be severely curtailed. If the ozone hole continues to widen and we see a decrease in ozone levels, ultraviolet radiation will suppress plant growth. What else will occur? Well, we just simply do not know. We do know that coastal cities will be perhaps inundated. At the very time they're inundated, we don't have the capital, or potentially inundated. We will not have the capital to dike the east coast of the United States like the Dutch have diked Holland. Global warming, I think, will alter the potential to produce food, alter the prospects for urban areas in ways we can barely imagine at this point. Let me give a third reason for ruralization. It's simply that cities aren't working. There's a massive breakdown in urban areas nearly everywhere. The larger the city, the bigger the breakdown. About 10 years ago, we had to coin a new word to describe urban residents. It was called the underclass. People who simply are, at this point, subhuman. We can continue to see a breakdown of cities, I suspect, crime, drug addiction, and at the very time in which cities will need massive infusions of capital, the United States is essentially bankrupt. The savings and loan crisis, federal deficits, trade deficits, a huge national debt. Now, I could look at all these trends and I could be still relatively optimistic about urban America if, in fact, there was a policy for urban America and a policy for rural America. But rather than that, we see continued neglect of cities. I come to a conclusion that ruralization, it isn't a matter of whether we re-ruralize massive numbers of people in the coming century, but rather how this will be done. And I'd like to suggest that there are basically two patterns. One of those patterns will be that these people will return to rural America as ecological refugees, a term that's come into use in the past 5 years. A second pattern would be that they come back as homecomers with skills, aptitudes, and attitudes to contribute to the rebuilding of rural America. The term homecomers is a term I've taken and borrowed from E.F. Schumacher in his book, Small is Beautiful. Schumacher says that there are two patterns for homecomers. One, both taken from the Bible. One is the parable of the prodigal son. That's interesting because that assumes that a homecomer comes back to a real home that is prosperous, that is thriving. And it assumes a degree of wisdom in the conduct of human affairs that we have yet to see in our own. The second pattern for homecomers, Schumacher says, is that of economics, the economics of the Sermon on the Mount. He takes 4 lessons from the Sermon on the Mount. First, we are poor. Second, we have plenty to be sorrowful about. Third, we need a gentle, nonviolent approach to ourselves and to the land. And fourth, we must concern ourselves with problems of justice and right relationships among people. Now, if I'm right, and in coming decades we see a massive reversion of people back to the land, the ruralization of America. To what America do they return? And here the news is not necessarily good. Compared to the first occupation of America, the soils now are thinner, the wildlife not nearly as abundant, whole forests are gone, the effects of air pollution and acid rain and toxic have taken their toll. Relative to cities, rural poverty rates are higher. Alcoholism, domestic violence are common and higher than in urban areas. Schools, services, health care generally in bad shape. The rural America that I know and have seen over the past 11 years is now commonly regarded by people on the East Coast as a good place to dump urban refuse, toxics, radioactive waste. Arkansas was getting, when I left Arkansas, I was getting waste from both Atlanta and New York City. Now, a question. I'll simply leave this as a question. Are these two things related? The process of urban decline and the failure to build good cities? Is somehow South Side Chicago related to decaying towns in Kansas, to boarded up storefronts, closed schools, businesses gone out of business? Are Watts, Bedford-Stuyvesant, South Side Chicago in some way linked to rural decline? I think that they are. Now, let me mention some myths. Our interaction with the American landscape has been affected, I think, by 6 myths. Let me mention these very quickly. First, there's a myth of cultural superiority. It is part of our baggage as Western people from the very beginning. In Frederick Turner's words, the first explorers in meeting the Indians and the indigenous people here in what was America, we were first brought into contact with our psychic and spiritual past, a contact for which we were utterly unprepared. And our record in the years since that have been no better. We showed a divorce of ourselves from our own psychic roots and from the whole process of living myth. This myth of cultural superiority still exists. Its most common form now is the myth that we won the Cold War. We didn't win the Cold War. If anybody's counting, the Japanese won it in the short term, and no industrial nation will win it in the long term without major changes. In the words of Ron Miller, who is editor of a journal called Holistic Education Review, our culture does not nourish that which is best or noblest in the human spirit. It does not cultivate vision, imagination, or aesthetic or spiritual sensitivity. It does not encourage gentleness, generosity, caring, or compassion. Increasingly, in the late 20th century, the economic, technocratic, statist worldview has become a monstrous destroyer of what is loving and life-affirming in the human soul. It's interesting to note that the countryside, rural areas under communism and capitalism both look a lot alike. Under communism, Stalin waged war against the kulak class and moved literally millions of people off the countryside with great brutality. But capitalism and the free market did much of the same thing here, moving people off the land into cities many times when they didn't want to go. The effects were much the same. There's a second myth. This is a myth that somehow the present is better than the past. We've not been able and willing to learn from the past. We've tended to denigrate tribal cultures and peasant cultures and villages and small towns, which is to say we've denigrated our own roots. There's been a major failure to come to grips with what historian Peter Laslett calls the world that we have lost. And now we need to go back to that world and understand what they knew that we have forgotten. Philip Slater, a psychologist, puts it in these words. All the errors and follies of magic, religion, and mystical traditions are outweighed by one great wisdom they contain: the awareness of humanity's organic embeddedness in a complex natural system. Let me repeat. The awareness of humanity's organic embeddedness in a complex natural system. And in all the brilliant, sophisticated insights of Western rationalism are set at naught by the egregious delusion on which they rest. The illusion of human autarky, that somehow we are independent of that natural world. What can we learn from tribal people? Well, I think were we willing, we would learn a great deal. Robert Redfield, the anthropologist, put it in these words: tribal cultures and peasant cultures possessed an intense attachment to native soil, a reverent disposition toward habitat and ancestral ways, a restraint on individual self-seeking in favor of family and community, a certain suspiciousness mixed with appreciation of town life, a sober and earthy ethic. There are things here that we can learn to become rooted people. I think a second thing. Stop and think that our sense of the sacred has by and large been derived from rural and village people. Abraham was a herdsman. Zoroaster raised cattle. Jesus was a village carpenter. Muhammad was a shepherd and a small trader. Buddha came from a remote village in Nepal. It's largely from rural areas and small villages from which we have derived the great religious truths of our race. There's a third myth, and this is the myth of American democracy. There is a confusion in the land that somehow our freedom to consume makes us democratic people. Yet at the same time, there is a decline in real democracy. There's a decline in the sense of participation and control of the daily affairs of life. I think we can trace this in American life to the failure of populism in the 1890s. Lawrence Goodwin, the historian, in his History of the Populist Era, says this: the idea of substantial democratic influence over the structure of the nation's financial system, a principle that had been the operative political objective of Greenbackers, quietly passed out of the American political dialogue. It has remained there ever since. In other words, the control of investment decisions in every small town and every state in the country are essentially non-political decisions. They were on the agenda in the 1880s and the 1890s. Is this in some sense related to the savings and loan crisis now? There is a split in our political language between the language of individualism, the political rhetoric that we have about self-gratification and taking care of number one, and the American values which are more collective. And there's a problem of running a democracy when 1% of the country controls 35% of the wealth. There was a massive transfer of wealth in the 1980s from the middle class and the poorer classes to the upper class. In 1980, the wealthiest 1% in the United States controlled about 17% of the wealth. By the end of the Reagan years, it was 35.7%. There's a fourth myth that has affected our relationships to the land, and it's the myth that the land was inexhaustible, the myth of American abundance. We have never seen this land objectively, fairly, and honestly. In 1881, Charles Dana Wilbur wrote these words: "In this miracle of progress, the plow was the avant courier, not by any magic or enchantment, not by incantations or offerings, but instead in the sweat of his face, toiling with his hands, man can persuade the heavens to yield their treasures. Man can persuade the heavens to yield their treasures of dew and rain upon the land he has chosen for his dwelling place. It is indeed a grand consent, or rather concert of forces, the human energy or toil, the vital seed and the polished raindrop that never fails to fall in answer to the imploring power of prayer of labor." In other words, the land was inexhaustible. We didn't need to worry about rain or drought. Rain would simply come. All you had to do was to plow. Now, the attitude hasn't died out. Richard Darman, who is director of the Office of Management and Budget and a Harvard graduate, perchance, gave a lecture at Harvard in which he said these words, and you can hear the echoes of Charles Dana Wilbur: "The radical anti-growth green perspective will prove too static. The needy of the world will not be helped by and will not settle for a neo-Luddite attack on technological advance. More generally, the human spirit, by definition, will not be limited to an aspiration for stasis. Americans did not fight and win the wars of the 20th century to make the world safe for green vegetables." I think there ought to be a way in which institutions can revoke degrees, so that maybe we could start here at Kansas State. That, Harvard really ought to reconsider Richard Darman's bachelor's degree, or conversely, Richard Darman, assuming that he could see that he said something really ridiculous, could go to Harvard and ask for his money back, get all his tuition payments back. There's a fifth myth that has affected our relationship to the land, and that is that the myth is that knowledge is increasing and will simply make up for our malfeasance toward the land. The belief is, and you find it in places like universities and colleges, that knowledge is growing and we're getting smarter and smarter. In fact, I think there's a case that we're at least breaking even, perhaps declining and becoming dumber. Let me give an example. In 1928, if I had asked a group of chemists what the effect of a substance like chlorofluorocarbons would be on the upper atmosphere of the stratosphere, they wouldn't have known. That would be a hypothetical question that might have been of interest to a science fiction writer. It wasn't important. It was hypothetical and trivial. In 1929, Thomas Midgley Jr. invented CFCs. Thomas Midgley Jr., by the way, holds the world's record for the most banned substances, as far as I know. He's the guy who gave us tetraethyl lead and invented chlorofluorocarbons, both of which are either banned or in the process of being banned. It wasn't until the early 1970s, in a process of total serendipity, that we discovered that CFCs, the chlorine in CFCs, in fact, breaks down ozone. Now, knowledge increased. In 1929, we learned how to make something that we did not know how to make before. But ignorance also increased, or the salience of that ignorance. What had been a trivial, hypothetical piece of ignorance now became a planet-threatening piece of ignorance. The idea that knowledge is growing, well, the truth of the matter is that some knowledge clearly is growing. We know how to make computers that we didn't used to know how to make, and do all kinds of clever things, but other knowledge is decreasing. David Ehrenfeld, a biologist at Rutgers, talks about the decline of ornithology and systematics in biology departments. He's writing a book called Forgotten or Lost Knowledge. And if you go through a university curriculum, you find lots of things that used to be taught and assumed to be important in the human condition that are now no longer taught. Not because they are unimportant, but because they've been squeezed out and crowded out. Among the things that have been crowded out, in the words of Barry Lopez, is a knowledge of how to live well in a place. Let me read this. This is a good quote. It is a chilling nature of modern society to find an ignorance of geography, local or national, as excusable as ignorance of hand tools, and to find the commitment of people to their home places only momentarily entertaining and finally naive. I am forced to the realization that something strange, if not dangerous, is afoot. Year by year, the number of people with first-hand experience in the land dwindles. Rural populations continue to shift to the cities. In the wake of this loss of personal and local knowledge, the knowledge from which your real geography is derived, the knowledge on which a country must ultimately stand or fail, has come something hard to define, but I think sinister and unsettling. He's writing about the knowledge of how to live well in a place, the kind of knowledge that Wendell Berry has written so eloquently about, a knowledge that I think, frankly, I could not have understood had I not spent the last 11 years in a place called Fox, Arkansas, where people lived like this, and the knowledge of how to live well in a place was part of the local culture. There's a final myth that's affected our relationship to the land, and that is the myth of management. Scientific American, September 1989 issue entitled a whole issue called Managing Planet Earth. Now, I'd like to submit very briefly that we can't manage planet Earth, that what we might do is manage ourselves. And managing ourselves means that we have to confront politics and economics and institutional behavior and social values. Earth is simply beyond our capability to manage and to manage well. There's a victory of instrumental rationality here, which is always destructive. Václav Havel, in a magnificent series of writings, says this: people thought they could explain and conquer nature, yet the outcome is that they destroyed it and disinherited themselves from it. I think the word disinherited in the context of Schumacher's use of homecomers and the parable of the prodigal son. We're simply strangers on the land. And yet our ancestors knew that the land in some sense was alive. It would speak to them. And after Descartes, we could no longer hear the voices. Instrumental rationality, to which we give so much credence, is like a monologue with us talking, so loudly, so insistently, and so hurriedly that we cannot hear what nature has to say. I think what Havel and other people who write in the same vein are saying is that our relationships with the natural world have to be less those of management, in which we are trying to control and manipulate the natural world, and more like a dialogue and a conversation in which the other side is listened to. Now, to re-inhabit rural America, we will need what I'd like to call a new agrarianism. It has several parts to it. And the first part is simply honesty. Let's face it, living in rural areas has often been hard. It's been dull, it's been lonely. If you're from the South and you're black, you know it has a very dark side. Part of the problem is the way we occupied the land. Wallace Stegner says this in a magnificent little book on the West as living space. Says our migratoriness has hindered us from becoming a people of communities and traditions. Especially in the West, it has robbed us of gods who make places holy. It has cut off individuals and families and communities from memory and the continuum of time. It has left at least some of us with a kind of spiritual pellagra, a deficiency disease, a hungering for the ties of a rich and stable social order. I think in some sense, honesty would call us to say that we occupied the land in the first time around as pioneers and as settlers, generally very badly. The second element of a new agrarianism will be a better philosophy, a better rural philosophy. Right now, we basically have none. I think this will be brought about by a dialogue with the land, a contact with the land, and using in Wendell Berry's phrase and Wes Jackson's phrase, nature as the measure. The makings of that philosophy, I think, could be found in Thoreau, in Aldo Leopold, in Wendell Berry, in the Boston University philosopher Erasm Kohak. It will not be clever mind games that we call philosophy. It will be philosophy as lived experience. There's a third element to the new agrarianism, and this is simply egalitarianism. I don't know that we can ever re-inhabit the land very well without coming to grips with ownership patterns and distribution. The fact is that the land is every year increasingly concentrated in a smaller and smaller number of hands. Absentee ownership is an issue. Foreign ownership is an issue. I think these ought to be on the political docket. I think it's time to question who owns land. If they don't live on the land, if they don't farm it or take care of it, perhaps we ought to restrict ownership. Nebraska has taken steps to do some of this. I think a new agrarianism, fourthly, will place the dignity of rural living much higher than industrial civilization has placed it. You know, one of the worst things after living for 11 years in Arkansas in the fifth poorest county and the 49th wealthiest state in the Union, rural people think of themselves very much in urban terms, derived from things like hee-haw, Dukes of Hazzard, and Green Acres. The common urban image of rural people is country bumpkins and hicks. There's a kind of imperialism here where the urban world reaches out and grabs the minds of kids in rural areas and draws them into this very self-deprecating worldview. Now, we have come a long way in thinking about language. You know, we now talk about it at Oberlin College, we have to talk about fresh persons. It's no longer fresh men. And I suppose there's a gain there, I don't know. We now treat sexist language as sexist language and racist language as racist language. But is there a counterpart here with terms that talk about rednecks and to denigrate people like typically happens on hee-haw, the country bumpkins of rural TV? There's a fifth element of the new agrarianism, and this is the new economics. It's an economics of place and region. There's a problem of mobile capital. For a while, I served on a committee to help rethink rural Arkansas development. And you know what the big plan for rural Arkansas was? Is to bring in a Toyota plant. And if capital is mobile enough to come into rural areas, it's mobile enough to get up and leave rural areas. The mobility of capital has wrought more destruction in rural areas than I can begin to tell you. The record of development is poor. In the late 1970s, the U.S. Department of Commerce did a study on how many jobs are created by imported capital. It turned out that the ratio is very low. It's about 1.6, which means that for every job that is created by a Toyota plant or capital coming into an area, there is created 0.6 of a job. And most of the jobs go to, certainly the white-collar jobs, go to outside people coming in. Herman Daly and John Cobb have recently written a book on community economics. And they say this in the book: attracting new workers into the community does not really develop the community, while projects that improve the range and efficiency of the economic activities of local people do develop the local community. They suggest that all our standard indices of economic development for communities are wrong. Indices that measure increasing sales, business volume, personal income, number of jobs are simply mistaken. And what they propose are to use availability of satisfying work as an index. secure access to biological and social necessities, stability as an indicator, things that make communities stimulating, diverse, and vital. I notice that that set of indicators is almost entirely non-economic, or non-economic in the way in which we've been accustomed to thinking about economics. Now, we have good examples of the way communities can develop like this. The Mondragon Cooperative Movement in Spain, Charles Peters' study of the Amazon economy, and we still have Amish economics to look to. Now, let me conclude with this place. What does all this mean for what happens at Kansas State University? I've argued that there will be a process set in motion of re-ruralizing large numbers of American citizens, that within another decade or two, the trend toward urbanization will be reversed. People will be coming back to rural areas. What kind of rural areas will they return to? Will there in fact be a home to return to? What's the role of Kansas State University in this process? Derek Bach, outgoing president at Harvard, wrote these words recently. He says, higher education has often failed to respond as effectively as it might even to some of the most important challenges facing America. Rarely, this is kind of pathetic, by the way, listen to this is good. Rarely have members of the Academy succeeded in discovering emerging issues and bringing them vividly to the attention of the public. What Rachel Carson did for risks to the environment, Ralph Nader did for for consumer protection, Michael Harrington for problems of poverty, Betty Friedan for women's rights. They did as independent critics, not as members of a faculty. We could add a long list of people to his list. Why is it that it takes Wes and Dana Jackson at the Land Institute to help get sustainable agriculture on the public agenda? And you can add your own people. What is it about the university? I think, in fact, it's even worse than Derek Bach suggests. Is the nation's land better farmed because of departments of agronomy? Are our forests better tended because of departments of forestry? Are our businesses more competitive because of business schools? Whose task is it here or in any university to see that knowledge is used well? Whose task is it to see that knowledge in fact supports local economies in the state and the region? We've tended to justify the existence of the university because of its contribution to what with great gravity is called the fund of human knowledge. And Page Smith, the historian, says this about this whole research justification. He says the vast majority of research turned out in the modern university is essentially worthless. It does not result in any measurable benefit to anything or anybody. It does not push back those frontiers of knowledge so confidently evoked. It does not in the main result in greater health or happiness among the general populace or any particular segment of it. It is busy work on a vast, almost incomprehensible scale. It is, he says, dispiriting. It depresses the whole scholarly enterprise, and most important of all, it deprives the student of what he or she deserves, the thoughtful and considerate attention of a teacher deeply committed to teaching. There is another model. It's an older model. It's a model the Greeks called paideia, which was a generalized search for excellence. I'd suggest three things about this model of paideia. For one thing, as the Greeks knew, it would reintroduce experience into the curriculum. The idea that we can separate experience from the life of the mind is simply a myth. And I would add to that manual education. Secondly, the Greek model of paideia knew that we don't just worry about competition with the Japanese. In fact, we worry about character formation. Education is about you, and it's about your stature as a person. Subject matter is merely the tool. It's the hammer and the chisel that you use to carve out your own stature as a human being. Thirdly, paideia was about diversity in the curriculum. A diversity that accepted all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of people. Wendell Berry, in what I think is an awfully moving passage, describes a local farmer that his brother, an attorney, had dealt with. And this is a local farmer who was an awfully good farmer. He was a land craftsman. And Wendell says that he knows where his brother's client would be tape recorded and studied and counted and perhaps laughed at in every university. But he does not know where this man, Mr. Yerry by name, would be appropriately honored. That's moving. There are lots of people like this that we simply rule out because they don't fit the stereotype of the learned person. And by doing so, we cut ourselves off from a diversity of knowledge, and perspectives, and opinion, and a wealth of skill and talent. Now, let me conclude here with 4 suggestions. These are specifically for Kansas State. The re-ruralization of America could begin here. But to begin here, it requires people who, first of all, are ecologically literate. Now, what does that mean? Let me suggest that no student should graduate from Kansas State. As a matter of fact, there ought to be an exam here that you can't get your BA or BS degree or whatever until you can explain to a faculty committee, and this assumes that they know this too, you can explain to a faculty committee the difference between, let's say, optimum and maximum, a difference lost on many economists. The difference between complexity and complicatedness, health and disease, the difference between stocks of resources and flows, the difference between design and planning, the difference between intelligence and cleverness, the difference between renewable and non-renewable, the difference between dwelling in a place and residing in a place. The difference between sufficiency and efficiency. That I owe to Wes Jackson. The difference between can do and should do. Now, you'll notice my list here. This is not, by the way, a true and false test. It's not even a multiple choice test. This is a list that crosses discipline boundaries. Requires a degree of perspective and ecological literacy. To explain the difference between each of these, you'd have to know a good bit about ecology, the social sciences, the humanities, and the physical sciences. Wallace Stegner tells a joke of an Indian who's dying of starvation, and the Indian finally sees a rabbit. And the rabbit takes off, and the Indian chases the rabbit, and this is a long chase, and the Indian's awfully hungry, and he goes over mountains and across streams, and finally corners the rabbit. And as he's pulling back his bow to shoot the rabbit sits up on his hind legs and says, "Arf, arf." And the Indian lets the tension back on his bow and says, "Are you really a rabbit?" And the rabbit says, "Oh, I'm a rabbit, all right, but in a tight spot like this, it pays to be bilingual." Of course, the rabbit is trilingual, but that's a minor quibble. We need to turn out students who, in fact, are bilingual or trilingual. Students who can comfortably cross the divisions of the humanities, the sciences, and the social sciences. We need a generation of Renaissance people, broad-gauge people, and people with a sense of commitment to the health and well-being of rural America and indeed to the entire planet. Let me suggest a second goal. We need a new generation of farmers and farm people. Kansas State could do a lot to help this. Why not a leadership development program? And this time around, we need better people on the land, perhaps, than some of the people that we've had. We need people who are willing to farm at a scale and with methods that, in fact, are conserving of the land. James Montmarquet, who's an historian at the University of Tennessee, puts it in these terms. We need to attract a different and better sort of individual to farming. We need to attract educated young people from both rural and urban backgrounds. Young people with the capacity to learn farming, but not necessarily with a farm background. People whose idealism and naturalistic interests could bring about a genuine renewal of rural life and culture in the United States. These people will be coming back. Many of my students would like to get back on the land, but how could this happen? Rural leadership needs capital, needs access to land. We need a whole different approach to banking and to enterprise. We need perhaps a rural Peace Corps to help re-inhabit the land. Let me suggest a third set of changes. These have to do with curriculum. There should be programs of sustainable agriculture, sustainable rural development, and community building. These ought to be parts of the curriculum here. I think you could do worse than to launch a debate about curriculum on a campus involving students and faculty and regents and trustees. A debate that begins with the work of John Dewey, includes people like Alfred North Whitehead, Bruce Wilshire, Page Smith, Wendell Berry. What is the purpose of this institution, and how does it relate to the land and the people and the area and the region and the state? What are its deeper responsibilities? Fourth, and very specifically, how this university and institutions like it spend their buying power. Where do they buy their food? Where do they buy their materials? Is there a policy for energy here? How this institution spends its institutional dollars, how it invests its endowment, has a lot to do with whether this area will be ready for ruralization or not. Now, no institution of which I'm aware, we finally passed, we got colleges to think about investments related to South Africa and investments that related to certain business criteria, Valdez principles. But what about the use of college budgets to help develop sustainable agriculture, local economies, keep that money local? One story I told this afternoon was of a college that we studied in Arkansas. It was buying its beef from the world's largest feedlot in Amarillo, Texas. The beef was then shipped to Chicago, Illinois, where it was slaughtered. Some of it got packaged in St. Louis, and then back down to Arkansas. So that beef had traveled around the country. In the meantime, in Arkansas, ranchers on the outskirts of town were going broke. The local slaughterhouse was going broke. Now, what the college finally decided to do was to save money and improve the quality by buying locally. The same story could be repeated many times over. Let me conclude with a comment from Aldo Leopold. Ruralization, I think, is a reality that will come upon us in a matter of a decade or two or three. I think it's in the long-term, big numbers of our time. Leopold once asked, do graduates of our educational institutions know that they're only cogs in an ecological mechanism? And if they will work with that mechanism, their mental wealth and material wealth can expand indefinitely. But if they refuse to work with it, it will ultimately grind them to dust. And then Leopold added these words. And if education does not teach us these things, then what is education for? Thank you.
Some of you need to leave, but some of you may have questions, and Dr. Orr has indicated that he would be willing to entertain questions from the audience.
Yes, Dr. Orr, a couple questions. One, how would you differentiate your view from Thomas Malthus? And two, do you think that energy is a constraint to development? Or is it just the way we're using energy and the type of energy that's a constraint to development?
All right, the question is, how would I differentiate my views from Thomas Malthus, the British parson? And then the second question is energy a constraint to development? First of all, on Malthus. Malthus saw a constraint to population growth in food production. And the common view is that Malthus is wrong because we've seen both rising populations and rising food production. Some of that in recent decades has been because of the Green Revolution, that we've been able to pump in a lot of fossil energy into the food system. The standard ratio you see in the literature is that we use 11 calories of fossil energy to put 1 calorie on a plate. So that in the whole food system, from farm to the plate, there are 11 calories of fossil energy embodied in the process to put 1 calorie of food value on the plate. My own hunch is this, that Malthus was right, he was just premature. and that in the long-term process, there are clear limits to what the land can do and what it can bear. And the technology cannot make up for these indefinitely. Now, energy is a constraint to development. Yes, energy is a constraint to development. There is a process, and Amory Lovins is the next speaker in this. Amory will tell you all about the potential for rising efficiency. It's clear, it's part of the trend. I've got a light on my desk in my office. It's a 13-watt compact fluorescent light that replaces a 60-watt incandescent light bulb. Energy efficiency has been in some ways responsible for unplugging the lockstep that existed between economic growth and energy growth. And we now get a good bit more gross national product, roughly 25% more than we did, in 1950 or some such, because of increasing efficiency. But energy is a constraint in the development process, and it's also what kind of energy. We're now finding that most people who think very hard about the issue of global warming are now arguing for a carbon tax. We simply can't continue to burn fossil fuels as we've been burning them. George Woodwell says that the total CO2 emissions are running about 7 to 9 billion tons a year. We would be at roughly steady state at about 3 billion tons a year. So somehow we've got to eliminate somewhere between 5 and 7 billion tons of CO2 emissions. So energy is a constraint in the development process. And it's unclear to me what the potential is for things like hydrogen fuels, which I think is one of the things that we've missed the boat on. But the point I'd like to make, and getting back first to the talk, is that the era of cheap energy is over. The fossil fuel era will have to end because of CO2, I'm sure, but in any event, we're not out of energy. We're out of cheap energy. And the long-term trend of energy at the equivalent of, say, $90 to $150 a barrel, which is where I think we're headed, will be to cause us to disaggregate large urban areas. Yes?
Why in the hell you want to move the scumbags from the East Coast and the degenerates of the West Coast to defile the Midwest, where the only decent place to live anymore is beyond my ken? Now, what you're offering us is a solution that's akin to Gresham's law, that bad money drives out good. And I'll tell you, as one who was born and raised in the East Coast and ran to the Midwest as quickly as I could, I'm against it.
But you're one of the good guys, especially. I knew somebody was going to ask that. I just knew it. Anybody else want to comment on that? I'm not going to touch that.
Concerning your first comment on megalopolis into megalopolis, the comment that you were making is pretty much the same as we saw in 1973 and 1979, where that people were saying, well, we're at the end of the fossil fuel era, we're going to see higher prices from now on. However, specifically after 1979, we did see an oil glut and cheaper prices, and right now we're pushing for more fuel efficiency and probably again that oil glut and cheaper prices. So my question is, with that trend occurring, is it not possible that once again we're going to see these cheaper prices, oil glut, and not possibly as quick of an end, or any end, to megalopolis as you foresee?
Well, short answer is no. Yeah, I wish I had a M. King Hubert's curve here, because what it shows is that Hubert in 1956 predicted that 1970 would be the peak year for extraction of oil production. Turned out he was right on the money. 1970 is the peak year, and oil production has declined in this country ever since. Now, there's several other things that I think, as indicators, we ought to look at. The same process is occurring worldwide, and we will peak worldwide. Oil production is expected to peak between the years 2010 and 2020. That's not far off as these things go. Secondly, if you look at what is called the energy return on investment, you find out that the energy return on investment has been declining steadily. In the United States, for example, Louisiana, there are parts of Louisiana oil fields that still have oil. But we will cross, according to people like Bob Costanza and other folks who study this, we will cross the 0 point where it takes more energy to get a barrel of oil out of the ground than it's worth. It takes more than a barrel to get a barrel out of the ground. Now, we're finding the same thing. We have to go farther, we have to go deeper. I mean, this process is getting more and more expensive. Now, for all of you who are draft age, it's a minor matter, I don't mean to be gruesome here, but those of you who are draft age, here we are in Saudi Arabia. And there is a difference between choosing to be in Saudi Arabia and having no choice but to be in Saudi Arabia. And it's a difference lost in the Bush administration. In a certain sense, we have no choice, like every addict has no choice but to fight to defend your source of supply. And our source of supply as an addict, I mean, we're fighting for the right for cheap energy. Now, I don't want to argue that we're going to run out of fuel. We're not ever going to run out of fossil fuels. But there are a couple of big constraints. One is we're running out very quickly of cheap fossil fuels. And now the geographic concentration means that we're more and more dependent on sources in a politically unstable area. And if oil wasn't there in Kuwait, which of you believes that we would be there as a humanitarian venture? We're not there to fight for the international community. We're there because there's oil there. I think the long-term trend is that production is coming down. There may be short blips in this process. Energy efficiency was largely responsible for the oil glut. The production stayed at the same level, declined slightly, but the consumption dropped much more rapidly in the Western industrial nations until 1986. Then in 1986, of course, these are all self-denying prophecies, that once you say that, well, oil's cheap, then you go back to big cars again, and that drives the price of oil up and creates scarcity. So we've got this self-denying prophecy phenomenon. I think the long-term trends are it's over. And even if it were abundant, even if we could say that there's a 500-year supply of oil in the ground in Texas, we can't burn it. It causes acid rain. It's rapidly heating the planet. I mean, the irony of this whole thing is that we're over there fighting for our right to get oil so we can heat the planet more rapidly.
You referred to the need for a new and improved rural philosophy. And I realize you've really talked about that for an hour, but could you be specific about what a new rural philosophy might be? And secondly, what factors do you think could realistically bring a university like Kansas State University to reorganize around such a focus?
Well, yeah, good question. We are urban people. Even our understanding of rural areas is through urban eyes. Rural America has been largely colonized and imperialized, and it's been the source of cheap energy, cheap materials, cheap people, cheap timber, cheap water to feed urban America. The history of the United States is urban history. We have very little conception of what a viable rural world would be like. As far as I know, we have no clearly stated policy for rural America. It says that rural America ought to survive as something other than a colony where resources can be brought in cheaply to urban America and as a repository for the garbage and waste that leaves urban America. I think we have the pieces of that philosophy. I think you can find it to a large extent in the writings of people like Wendell Berry, Liberty Hyde Bailey, Thoreau, Leopold, a whole host of thinkers. By the way, if you'd like to read books on the subject, James Marquet, the historian I mentioned at the University of Tennessee, has written a good book on the history of agrarianism. And so it has long roots, but there's always been this uncomfortable relationship between cities and the countryside. Now, one element of agrarianism, let me only really focus on one element, it's egalitarian distribution, and it's where we have fallen down. Increasingly, land has gotten more and more concentrated, income more and more concentrated. And I don't think you can run a good rural society without facing land ownership and land distribution. I was told by somebody before the talk that if I talk about land redistribution, I'd be regarded as a kook. But here's okay, I'll take the risk. But one of the scenarios I think that one can see is that if people do begin coming back to rural areas, as I argue they will, the process will look more and more like Latin America. Large latifundios, absentee-owned corporate estates. and we simply compound the problems of rural poverty. Now, I'm a Jeffersonian. I'm not a socialist in the sense I'm a Jeffersonian. And like Jefferson, I believe private property is such a good thing that everybody ought to have some of it. And I believe also that the economics of production, and we see this in Marty Strange's book on family farming, one of the arguments for massive farms has always been efficiency. And so Strange, citing the work of the economist Patrick Madden at Penn State, says, no, you actually find small farms, somewhere between $40 and roughly, say, $110,000 of gross sales, reaching 90% of the economies of scale. And then the next 10% of economies of scale are reached at relatively small increments above that. And so statistically, economically, in very hard economic terms, the justification for large farms tends to be spurious. Their ecological side effects, on the contrary, I think are serious. In Strange's book, Marty's book, is an argument for owner-operated family farms. They're not perfect, but they're the best solution we've had. And I think that you find a correlation in land ownership patterns and urban decay. And the problem is you just drive lots of people. If you drive enough people off the land, they have to go to the cities. And what do they do in the cities? Well, they become part of this permanently unemployed group in the cities. You know, Thomas Jefferson, I wonder if you could bring Jefferson into the United States now and say, look, we've got 7 or 8% on average in industrial countries who are called, quote, structurally unemployed. What would you say to Thomas Jefferson to justify 7 to 8% of the population of a country being structurally unemployed? There's no word for them, which means in a way there's no personhood for them, to the extent that a person's identity and selfhood is formed out of what they can make and what they can do. So, one element of the new agrarianism, I think, is going to be egalitarianism, a Jeffersonian egalitarianism. Oh, now you're getting me into political details. No, it's one of the little paradoxes. It's a problem. Jefferson owned slaves. Excuse me, I'm not hearing all of you're saying.
Jefferson's philosophy was wrong. Virginia never had an egalitarian society, even amongst the whites.
Yeah, there's truth in what you're saying. Jefferson wrote as a slave owner and a large landowner. His writings defending, especially the early Jefferson, in Notes on Virginia, defend a different kind of world. And there are these little paradoxes. You're right.
What kind of world are we talking about? It's really a pre-technological world. It's a world without the others. I mean, this is what Barry is always telling us.
This is what?
Well, Barry is really telling us.